Welcome, wanderer of the waking world. Lay down your thoughts and step softly into the realm between dreaming and remembering. Tonight's story weaves together two seekers of the soul, Carl Gustav Jung, the cartographer of the collective unconscious, and Henri Bergson, the philosopher of creative becoming. Together and apart, they navigated the currents of consciousness that flow beneath the surface of rational thought, each mapping territories where time dissolves and intuition speaks. As you settle into bed, let the rhythm of my voice carry you closer to sleep, one idea at a time. Relax as we explore how these two minds approached the mystery of inner life. One, seeing consciousness shaped by timeless archetypal forms rising from depths beyond personal memory. The other, discovering duration as a continuous flowing stream where past and present interpenetrate in endless creative motion. Their dialogue, whether spoken or across time, illuminates the vast territories of human consciousness. If you enjoy these quiet tales of psychological dialogue and wonder, press the like button and subscribe to join me on future journeys through the conversations between great minds. Tell me in the comments which psychological relationship intrigues you most, the mentor and student, the collaborators, the friendly rivals, and together we'll explore them in nights to come. Now, let the world fade. Drift with me through the intertwining paths of Jung and Bergson as we wander between their visions and listen to the echoes where their insights meet and part. In the opening years of the 20th century, while electric lights were beginning to illuminate the darkened streets of European cities and the industrial age was transforming the rhythms of human existence, two men were independently pursuing a revolution of consciousness itself. One worked in the consulting rooms of Zurich's Bergholzli Hospital, listening to the fragmented speech of those the world called mad, searching for patterns in their symbolic utterances. The other sat in the lecture halls of the Collège de France, weaving philosophical arguments that would challenge the very foundations of how Western civilization understood time, memory, and the nature of reality itself. They would never meet, these two, Carl Jung and Henri Bergson, yet their paths crossed in that invisible country where philosophy touches psychology, where intuition reaches toward the ineffable, and where the question of what it means to be conscious becomes a question of what it means to be alive. To understand their relationship, we must first step backward into the world that formed them both, a world trembling on the edge of transformation. The 19th century was dying, and with it, the certainty that science could reduce all mysteries to mechanistic explanations. Darwin had shown that life itself was creative, evolving, moving toward forms that could not have been predicted from earlier states. Nietzsche had proclaimed the death of God and the necessity of creating new values. The confident materialism that had promised to explain consciousness as merely the product of neural machinery was beginning to encounter phenomena it could not easily dismiss: the reality of subjective experience, the vividness of memory, the inexplicable creativity of human thought, and most troubling of all, the strange eruptions from the unconscious mind that suggested depths psychology had barely begun to fathom. Carl Gustav Jung was born on July 26, 1875, in Keswil, Switzerland, into a family marked by the tension between religious tradition and modern doubt. His father was a Protestant pastor whose faith had grown hollow through years of performing rituals he could no longer believe in with his whole heart. His mother was a woman of two personalities, one conventional and comfortable, the other strange and nocturnal, given to visions and utterances that seemed to come from some deeper source. Young Carl grew up in this atmosphere of religious forms emptied of vitality, and from his earliest years, he sensed that beneath the surface of conventional reality lay another world entirely, one that spoke in dreams and symbols, in sudden visions that seized him with numinous power. Jung's childhood was marked by experiences that orthodox psychology could not explain. He had dreams of overwhelming intensity of God destroying a cathedral with a great excrement falling from heaven, an image that simultaneously horrified and liberated him, showing that God was not contained in human institutions but was a living force that could demolish what humans built in his name. He experienced what he would later call a split in his personality. Personality number 1 was the schoolboy, awkward and uncertain, while personality number 2 was ancient and wise, connected to the deep past of humanity. These experiences taught him early that consciousness was not singular or simple, but multiple, layered, containing within itself traces of something far older than personal memory. When Jung entered medical school at the University of Basel in 1894, he was torn between the concrete reality of science and the symbolic reality of philosophy and theology. He devoured the works of philosophers, seeking in their systems some explanation for his own inner experiences. He read Kant and Schopenhauer, Nietzsche and Eduard von Hartmann. He was particularly drawn to those thinkers who recognized that consciousness was more than a passive mirror reflecting external reality, that it had depths and structures of its own. Yet philosophy alone could not satisfy him. He needed a discipline that would allow him to encounter these depths practically in the living reality of human suffering and transformation. Psychiatry offered that possibility. In 1800, when Jung discovered psychiatry through reading Richard von Krafft-Ebing's textbook, he experienced what he described as a revelation. Here was a field that touched both the biological and the spiritual, the scientific and the symbolic. Here was a way to study the living psyche in its most extreme manifestations, where the carefully constructed edifice of rational consciousness had crumbled, revealing the raw materials from which consciousness is built. Jung joined the Burghölzli Psychiatric Hospital in Zurich in 1900, under the direction of Eugen Bleuler, one of the most respected psychiatrists in Europe, and there he began his investigations into the word association experiments that would first bring him fame, revealing through patterns of response and delay the presence of emotionally charged complexes operating beneath conscious awareness. Meanwhile, in Paris, Henri Bergson had been pursuing his own revolution in understanding. Born on October 18, 1859, Bergson was 16 years Jung's senior, already an established philosophical force by the time Jung was beginning his psychiatric work. Bergson had been a prodigy, brilliant in mathematics, equally gifted in languages and letters. He entered the École Normale Supérieure in 1878, that training ground of French intellectual life, where he studied philosophy and mathematics with equal facility. Yet, something in the mechanistic worldview that dominated late 19th century thought troubled him. The philosophers and scientists of his time attempted to understand consciousness, time, and change through spatial metaphors, as if time were merely a line on which moments were arranged like points on a geometric figure. Bergson's first major work, Time and Free Will, published in 1889 when Jung was still a teenage boy wrestling with his inner visions, challenged this spatial understanding of duration. Time as we live it, Bergson argued, is not a series of discrete moments arranged in space, but a continuous flowing stream in which past and present interpenetrate. When we experience duration, la durée, we experience our consciousness not as a series of separate states, but as a continuous melody in which each moment contains the echo of all that came before, colored by memory, swelling toward the future. This living time, this duration, could not be captured by the mathematical abstractions of science. It could only be grasped through intuition, through a kind of direct knowing that placed us inside the flow of becoming rather than outside it, observing as spectators. This was radical. Western philosophy, since Plato had generally privileged the stable, the eternal, the unchanging forms behind the flux of appearances. But Bergson insisted that change itself was primary, that becoming was more fundamental than being, that the universe was characterized not by static forms but by creative evolution, by an élan vital, a vital impulse that drove life toward ever more complex and free expressions. Life was not the mechanical unfolding of predetermined patterns, but genuine creativity, the emergence of the genuinely new. By 1900, when Jung was just beginning his psychiatric career, Bergson was already famous throughout Europe. His lectures at the Collège de France drew not just philosophers and students, but artists, society figures, anyone who wanted to hear this eloquent man articulate a vision of consciousness and reality that honored lived experience, rather than reducing it to mechanical abstractions. His book, Matter and Memory, published in 1896, explored the relationship between brain and consciousness, arguing that the brain was not the producer of consciousness, but rather a filter, selecting from the vast totality of memories only those relevant to present action. Consciousness, for Bergson, was far vaster than the narrow beam of attention that illuminated immediate practical concerns. These two men, then, were working in parallel toward a new understanding of consciousness in the opening years of the 20th century. Jung was exploring the depths of the psyche through clinical work, through listening to the dreams and delusions of his patients, through analyzing the patterns of association that revealed unconscious complexes. Bergson was exploring consciousness through phenomenological reflection, through careful analysis of what it actually felt like to experience time, memory, perception, and will. Both were resisting the dominant mechanistic paradigm. Both were insisting that consciousness could not be reduced to brain mechanisms, that something essential was lost when you tried to translate the living reality of subjective experience into the objective language of physics and chemistry. Yet their methods were profoundly different. Jung moved toward the concrete, the symbolic, the imaginal. He collected dreams, amplified mythological motifs, traced the appearances of archetypal patterns across cultures. Bergson moved toward the abstract, toward philosophical precision, toward careful distinctions and arguments that would convince through logical rigor even as they pointed toward something beyond logic. Jung descended into depths, into the historical layers of the unconscious, into the archaic images that arose from the collective experience of humanity. Bergson remained with the flow of immediate experience, with duration as it presented itself in the living moment, without requiring historical or archetypal grounding. The question of whether Jung read Bergson directly is one that scholars have debated. Jung's collected works contain few explicit references to Bergson, yet it is almost inconceivable that Jung, who read voraciously in philosophy and who spent time in Paris in 1902 attending lectures by Pierre Janet, could have remained entirely unaware of Bergson's work. Bergson was the most famous philosopher in Europe in the early decades of the 20th century. His ideas permeated intellectual culture, discussed in salons and journals, influencing artists and writers and psychologists alike. James Joyce's stream of consciousness technique owes something to Bergson's duration. Marcel Proust's exploration of involuntary memory echoes Bergsonian themes. The whole modernist movement in art and literature was influenced by Bergson's validation of intuition, flux, and the creative transformation of time. More significantly, Jung's engagement with William James provides an indirect connection to Bergson. James and Bergson admired each other's work enormously. James praised Bergson's creative evolution as a work of genius, and their correspondence shows deep mutual respect. Jung knew James's work well. He cited the varieties of religious experience frequently, and James's radical empiricism, his willingness to take religious and paranormal experiences seriously as psychological data, aligned with Jung's own approach. Through James, the Bergsonian emphasis on the stream of consciousness, on the continuity and interpenetration of mental states, on the inadequacy of mechanistic explanations, would have been available to Jung even if he had not read Bergson directly. But perhaps the question of direct influence is less important than the question of convergence. In the intellectual atmosphere of the early 20th century, multiple thinkers were independently arriving at similar insights about consciousness, time, and the limitations of scientific materialism. Edmund Husserl was developing phenomenology, the careful description of consciousness as it presents itself in experience. William James was formulating his radical empiricism and his psychology of religion. Henri Bergson was articulating his philosophy of duration and intuition. Carl Jung was discovering the collective unconscious and the reality of archetypal symbols. These movements were not isolated from each other. They emerged from the same cultural moment, the same sense that the dominant paradigms were inadequate to capture the fullness of human experience. Jung's concept of intuition as one of the four psychological functions bears both similarities to and differences from Bergson's understanding of intuition. For Jung, intuition was one of the four basic psychological functions by which the ego orients itself in the world alongside sensation, thinking, and feeling. Intuition, in Jung's typology, was the function that perceived possibilities, that grasped the whole rather than the parts, that had hunches and sudden knowings about what lay beyond immediate perception. An intuitive type, in Jung's system, was someone for whom this function was dominant, someone who lived more in future possibilities than present actualities, who made leaps of understanding without being able to explain the logical steps, who trusted the sudden flash of insight more than careful sensory observation or logical analysis. For Bergson, intuition was not a psychological type, but an epistemological method, a way of knowing distinct from analysis. Analysis, Bergson argued, breaks things into parts, translates continuous wholes into discrete units, represents living duration through spatial metaphors and mathematical symbols. Analysis is the method of science, immensely useful for manipulating the material world, but incapable of grasping the inner nature of consciousness, life, and time. Intuition, by contrast, was a kind of intellectual sympathy by which one places oneself inside something, grasping it from within rather than observing it from without. When we intuit duration, we do not conceptualize time or analyze it into moments. We live it. We feel the continuous flow of becoming from inside the stream itself. Intuition was how we knew ourselves directly, not through concepts but through immediate experience. Both men valued intuition as a way of knowing that transcended rational analysis. Both saw intuition as essential for grasping the living reality of consciousness that eluded the methods of natural science. Yet Jung embedded intuition within a broader psychological system where it balanced and interacted with other functions, while Bergson elevated intuition to the privileged method for philosophical knowledge. For Jung, intuition needed to be balanced by sensation, thinking needed to be balanced by feeling, or else the personality became one-sided, neurotic, cut off from important dimensions of reality. For Bergson, intuition was not one faculty among others, but the fundamental way consciousness knew itself, and philosophy's task was to cultivate intuition as a method to train ourselves to think intuitively rather than analytically when we sought to understand life, consciousness, and becoming. The period from 1900 to 1913 was formative for both men, though in different ways. For Jung, these were the years of his association and then break with Sigmund Freud, the years when he was struggling to articulate his own vision of the psyche distinct from Freud's reductive approach. Jung met Freud in 1907, and for several years they were close collaborators, with Freud seeing Jung as his crown prince, the Gentile who would carry psychoanalysis beyond its Jewish-Viennese origins. But Jung could not accept Freud's insistence that sexuality was the primary drive behind all neurosis and dream symbolism. Jung's own experience and clinical observations suggested that the psyche had spiritual dimensions that could not be reduced to repressed sexual wishes. The unconscious, for Jung, was not merely personal but collective, containing archetypal patterns that were religious in nature, that connected the individual to the deep history of humanity's spiritual quest. The break with Freud in 1913 plunged Jung into a crisis that he would later call his confrontation with the unconscious, a period of intense inner turmoil lasting several years during which he was flooded with visions, fantasies, and dreams that seemed to come from a source far deeper than his personal history. He recorded these experiences in what became known as the Red Book, a manuscript of overwhelming symbolic richness that he worked on for 16 years but never published in his lifetime. During this period, Jung encountered what he would later call the archetypes of the collective unconscious, the anima, the shadow, the wise old man, the child figures that appeared spontaneously in his visions and seemed to have autonomous existence, speaking to him, guiding him, threatening him, teaching him. This was Jung's descent into the depths, his own nekia, his journey to the underworld. And what he discovered there was not the personal repressed contents that Freud's system predicted, but transpersonal symbolic forms, images that had appeared in myths and religions throughout human history. This convinced Jung that the unconscious had a collective dimension, that beneath the personal unconscious with its repressed memories and complexes lay a deeper stratum of the psyche shared by all humanity, populated by archetypal images that shaped consciousness from below, that manifested in dreams, in artistic visions, in the delusions of the insane, in the myths and symbols of religions. Bergson, during these same years, was at the height of his fame and productivity. His book, Creative Evolution, published in 1907, extended his philosophy of duration to the realm of biology, arguing that evolution was not a mechanical process, but a creative one, driven by an elan vital that could not be reduced to either mechanistic causation or teleological purpose. Life, Bergson argued, was characterized by indeterminacy, by genuine novelty, by the capacity to create forms that could not have been predicted from earlier states. This was a direct challenge to both mechanistic Darwinism and to neo-Lamarckian theories of directed evolution. Bergson proposed that life itself was a kind of consciousness, a creative impulse that invented new forms through a process that was neither random nor predetermined but genuinely creative. This was controversial. Scientists criticized Bergson for introducing metaphysical speculation into biology. Philosophers debated whether his élan vital was a meaningful concept or a poetic evasion, but the book was immensely influential, capturing the imagination of a generation seeking alternatives to mechanistic materialism. Bergson seemed to offer a philosophy that honored science while not reducing everything to mechanical causation, that accepted evolution while insisting on creativity and freedom, that took seriously the subjective experience of consciousness while maintaining philosophical rigor. By 1914, when the First World War began, both Jung and Bergson had articulated the core of their respective visions, though both would continue developing and refining their ideas for decades to come. The war itself affected them differently. Jung, in neutral Switzerland, continued his inner work, emerging from his confrontation with the unconscious with the beginnings of his mature psychology. Bergson, in France, became involved in diplomatic missions, using his international reputation to help build support for the Allied cause. After the war, Bergson turned increasingly toward questions of morality and religion, culminating in his final major work, The Two Sources of Morality and Religion, published in 1932, which explored the distinction between closed morality based on social obligation and open morality based on creative mysticism. Jung, after the war, began to publish the works that would establish analytical psychology as a distinct school. Psychological Types, published in 1921, articulated his theory of psychological functions and attitudes, showing how different individuals orient themselves to reality in fundamentally different ways. Through the 1920s and 30s, Jung developed his ideas about the collective unconscious, the archetypes, the process of individuation, the religious dimensions of the psyche. He traveled to Africa, to India, to the Pueblo peoples of New Mexico, seeking to understand how different cultures experienced and symbolized the archetypal patterns he believed were universal. The two men moved in overlapping circles of European intellectual life, but apparently never met. Both were internationally renowned by the 1920s. Both lectured widely, though Bergson's lectures were public philosophical events, while Jung's were often to specialized audiences of psychiatrists and psychologists. Both were concerned with the crisis of Western civilization, with what had been lost in the triumph of scientific materialism, with the need to recover dimensions of human experience that modernity had forgotten or repressed. Yet their temperaments and methods kept them apart. Bergson remained fundamentally a philosopher, concerned with conceptual precision, with arguments, with convincing through logical analysis, even when pointing toward realities beyond logic. Jung became increasingly a psychological mystic, an explorer of symbolic territories, someone who thought in images and stories more than in arguments. Bergson wrote with extraordinary clarity, his French prose admired for its elegance and precision. Jung wrote densely, elusively, his prose packed with mythological and alchemical references that demanded readers follow him into symbolic depths. Bergson sought to reform philosophy. Jung sought to heal the modern soul. In their later years, both received the recognition of their times while also experiencing intellectual isolation. Bergson was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1927, one of the few philosophers to receive that honor, though by then his style of philosophy was already falling out of favor as analytic philosophy and existentialism became the dominant movements. Jung became world famous, but also controversial, suspect to orthodox Freudians as a mystical heretic, suspect to scientists as insufficiently rigorous, his work on alchemy and mythology seeming eccentric or worse to many of his psychiatric colleagues. Bergson died in January of 1941 in occupied Paris, an old man who had converted to Catholicism but, in solidarity with the Jewish people from whom he had descended, refused to claim exemption from the anti-Jewish laws the Vichy government had imposed. He stood in line to register, despite his illness, a gesture of remarkable moral courage. Jung lived until June of 1961, dying at his house in Küsnacht at the age of 85, having witnessed the world he knew destroyed twice by world wars, having seen the rise and fall of fascism, having continued until the end to write, to dream, to explore the symbolic dimensions of consciousness. These biographical trajectories give us the human context for understanding how their ideas related, but now we must turn to the ideas themselves, to the substance of their visions, to explore more deeply where they converged and diverged in their understanding of consciousness, intuition, time, and the nature of inner life. At the heart of Bergson's philosophy lay the concept of durée, which he distinguished sharply from the abstract, spatialized time that science measures. When we measure time with clocks, when we think of time as a series of instants arranged like points on a line, we have, Bergson argued, translated the living reality of temporal experience into a spatial metaphor. This is useful for science and practical life, but it misses what time actually is as we live it from within. Consider, Bergson invited his readers, the experience of listening to a melody. We do not hear it as a series of separate notes unless we adopt a deliberately analytical attitude. Rather, we hear the melody as a unified whole, with each note containing the resonance of notes that came before, with the earlier notes colored by what came after, with the entire sequence experienced as a continuous flow, an indivisible unity that cannot be broken into parts without destroying what makes it a melody. This, Bergson said, was duration. Consciousness is like that melody, a continuous flowing stream in which past and present interpenetrate, in which memory is not stored in discrete locations, but saturates the present moment with the accumulated weight of everything we have experienced. This conception of consciousness as continuous flow has obvious resonances with William James's stream of consciousness metaphor, and indeed James acknowledged his debt to Bergson. But Bergson pushed further into the metaphysical implications. If consciousness is duration, if our inner life is characterized by continuous becoming rather than discrete states, then something similar must be true of reality itself. Change is not the movement from one static state to another, but the fundamental character of being. The universe, at its deepest level, is not a collection of things, but a creative process, an ongoing becoming. Jung's vision of consciousness was quite different in structure, though it shared Bergson's resistance to mechanistic reduction. For Jung, consciousness was not primarily characterized by continuous flow, but by structure, by the arrangement of complexes, by the interplay of ego and unconscious, by the tension between persona and shadow, anima and animus, by the organizing influence of archetypal patterns. Where Bergson emphasized flow, continuity, and interpenetration, Jung emphasized differentiation, conflict, and the need for integration. This difference reflects their different starting points. Bergson began with phenomenological reflection on time consciousness, with what could be known immediately through turning attention inward to the quality of lived experience. Jung began with pathology, with the ruptures and fragmentations of consciousness visible in mental illness, with the autonomous complexes that could split off from the ego and take on seemingly independent existence. For Bergson, consciousness in its normal state was unified, a continuous whole that only appeared fragmented when viewed through the artificial lens of spatial analysis. For Jung, consciousness was inherently multiple, composed of relatively autonomous systems that could conflict with each other, with unity, something that had to be achieved through the difficult process of individuation rather than something given in the structure of experience. Consider how each would approach the phenomenon of memory, which both saw as central to understanding consciousness. For Bergson, memory was not stored in the brain like data in a computer. Rather, the past continued to exist in its entirety. And memory was the process by which consciousness accessed the past, relevant to present action. The brain was a filter, narrowing the vast totality of memory down to what was practically useful at any given moment. In rare cases, in dreams, in moments of shock or intense emotion, under hypnosis the filter relaxed and vaster ranges of memory became accessible. This led Bergson to a striking conclusion. Consciousness was far vaster than the narrow beam of attention we normally experience. Our entire past continued to exist, not in some spatial location, but as pure duration. And in principle, if the brain's filtering function were removed entirely, we would have access to the totality of our experience. This matched certain strange phenomena, the reports of drowning people who saw their entire lives flash before them, the hypermnesias produced in hypnotic states, the way a scent or a taste could suddenly open vast vistas of forgotten experience, as Proust would famously demonstrate in his exploration of involuntary memory. Jung also insisted that nothing was truly forgotten, that everything we experienced remained somewhere in the psyche. But he located this persistence differently. For Jung, memories that were not accessible to consciousness were in the unconscious, and the unconscious was not simply the past filtered out, but a realm with its own structure and activity. The unconscious was not passive storage, but active transformation. Dreams showed that unconscious material was constantly being reconfigured, elaborated through symbolic processes, connected to archetypal patterns that came not from personal experience, but from the collective unconscious. Where Bergson saw memory as the past continuing to exist in pure form, Jung saw memory as something transformed by the unconscious, woven into symbolic narratives, amplified by archetypal associations. A childhood memory, in Jung's view, was never recovered in pure form. It came to consciousness already interpreted, already connected to broader patterns of meaning. This was why active imagination and dream analysis were so important in Jung's method. They revealed not just what had happened, but how the psyche had symbolized those experiences, what archetypal patterns had been constellated, what the unconscious was attempting to communicate through its symbolic elaborations. This points to a fundamental difference in how the two men understood the relationship between consciousness and something beyond consciousness. For Bergson, intuition gave us direct access to our own duration, and by extension, to the duration of life and the universe. When we intuited our own consciousness, we grasped reality as it truly was, from within, without the distorting mediation of spatial concepts. Intuition was thus a kind of direct knowing, unmediated, immediate, a coinciding of consciousness with itself and ultimately with the creative impulse that drove all life. For Jung, there was no such direct access to the deeper layers of the psyche. The unconscious could not be known directly, but only through its manifestations in dreams, in symptoms, in projections, in synchronistic events that revealed meaningful connections between inner and outer reality. And these manifestations were always symbolic, always requiring interpretation and amplification. The archetypal images that arose from the collective unconscious were not concepts that could be grasped through intuition, but numinous presences that could only be experienced and related to, never fully comprehended. This difference reflects divergent views about the nature of the unconscious. Bergson, in fact, was suspicious of the whole concept of the unconscious as it was being developed by psychoanalysis. He saw consciousness as extensive with memory, with our entire past somehow present, if not in focal awareness, then in the penumbra that surrounded it. What Freud called the unconscious, Bergson suggested, was simply memory that was not presently useful for action, and so was filtered out by the brain's selective mechanisms. There was no need to posit a separate realm of unconscious processes governed by their own logic. Jung, by contrast, came to see the unconscious as far more than just forgotten memories. His clinical experience and his own inner confrontation with the unconscious convinced him that the unconscious had its own intelligence, its own purposes, its own symbolic language. The unconscious was not merely the past, but the matrix of future possibilities. It contained not just what had been experienced and forgotten, but potentials that had never been actualized, archetypal patterns that were not learned from experience, but were inherited structures shaping consciousness from below. This brings us to perhaps the most fascinating point of convergence and divergence, the question of creativity and the emergence of the new. Both Bergson and Jung insisted that human consciousness and life itself were genuinely creative. That mechanism could not account for the appearance of novel forms and insights, but they located creativity differently. For Bergson, creativity was the fundamental nature of duration itself. Every moment of genuine duration was creative because it added something absolutely new to what existed before. When we act freely, when we make a genuine choice rather than following habitual patterns, we create ourselves anew. The universe itself, driven by the élan vital, was constantly creating novel forms, constantly inventing solutions to the problems life encountered. This creativity was not random, it had direction. It moved toward increasing complexity and freedom, but it was not predetermined. The future was genuinely open, genuinely created moment by moment through the living of duration itself. This was a thoroughgoing metaphysics of becoming. Being was always becoming, always in the process of creating itself. The stable forms that science studied were abstractions, useful for practical purposes but not ultimate realities. The ultimate reality was the creative process itself, duration in its pure form. Jung's view of creativity was more complex and more ambivalent. On one hand, the process of individuation was creative. It involved the ego coming into relationship with unconscious contents and integrating them, creating a more complete and differentiated personality. The production of dreams and active imagination was creative. The unconscious constantly generated new symbolic forms, new images that had never existed before yet drew on archetypal patterns. But this creativity was constrained and shaped by the archetypes themselves. The archetypes were not products of creative evolution, but eternal forms, patterns that structured consciousness in all times and places. Individual creativity consisted not in creating entirely new patterns, but in giving unique personal expression to eternal themes. The hero's journey had been undertaken by countless individuals throughout history. What was creative was how each person lived their particular version of that archetypal pattern. Here we see a fundamental divergence. Bergson's philosophy was radically temporal. Everything was becoming, everything was new. Even if the creative process had directions and tendencies, even if life solved similar problems in analogous ways, Jung's psychology pointed toward the eternal. The archetypes were timeless. They appeared in ancient myths and modern dreams. With essential similarity, they connected the individual to something that transcended temporal existence. This difference played out in their respective attitudes toward history and myth. Bergson had relatively little interest in history or mythology. He was concerned with the present moment of experience, with how consciousness worked now, not with tracing historical patterns or comparing mythological motifs across cultures. His method was phenomenological and introspective, not comparative or historical. Jung, by contrast, was deeply immersed in history, particularly the history of symbols. He studied alchemy, Gnosticism, medieval mysticism, the mythologies of cultures around the world, searching for the recurring patterns that would reveal the archetypal structures of the collective unconscious. For Jung, the past was not simply the accumulated duration that Bergson described, but a treasury of symbolic forms that remained living and active in the unconscious, ready to be reactivated in dreams and visions. This led to different attitudes toward dreams, which is striking given that both recognize dreams as revealing something essential about consciousness. Bergson largely minimized the significance of dreams. In Dreams, a small book published in 1914, Bergson argued that dreams were produced when the brain's filtering function relaxed during sleep, allowing vast ranges of memory to flood consciousness. Dreams seemed bizarre and symbolic because they followed the logic of memory association rather than practical action, but they did not reveal a separate unconscious realm with its own purposes. They were simply consciousness freed from the constraint of having to act in the world, playing with memories according to associations of similarity and contiguity. For Jung, this view would have been hopelessly superficial. Dreams were not random memory associations, but purposeful communications from the unconscious. They used symbolic language because that was the language of the unconscious, which thought in images rather than concepts. Dreams compensated conscious attitudes, revealing what the ego had neglected or repressed. They brought messages from the self, that archetype of wholeness that guided the individuation process. They showed future possibilities, anticipated problems, revealed hidden aspects of situations. To treat dreams as merely playful memory associations was to miss their profound psychological and even spiritual significance. This difference about dreams points to a broader difference about the purpose of consciousness itself. For Bergson, consciousness existed for action. The brain and nervous system had evolved as instruments of action, allowing organisms to respond flexibly to their environment. Consciousness was at its most acute when we were confronted with genuine choices, when habit was inadequate and we had to create a new response. In moments of routine, consciousness faded because it was not needed. This was why, Bergson suggested, we remember so little of our ordinary days when we are following habitual patterns. Consciousness is minimal, and there is little to remember. Jung would have agreed that consciousness served adaptation to the environment, but he insisted it had other purposes as well, purposes that became clear especially in the second half of life. The psyche was not only oriented outward toward practical action, but inward toward meaning, toward the achievement of wholeness, toward the realization of the self. This was the individuation process, the central goal of human development in Jung's view. It involved withdrawing projections, integrating shadow elements, coming into right relationship with the contrasexual archetypes of anima and animus, and ultimately experiencing the self as the center of the personality more fundamental than the ego. This individuation process required consciousness to turn inward, to attend to dreams and fantasies, to engage in active imagination, to wrestle with symbolic material that had no immediate practical application. From a Bergsonian perspective, this might seem like a deflection of consciousness from its proper purpose. But for Jung, this inner work was essential to becoming fully human, to achieving the wholeness that the psyche naturally moved toward, if not blocked by neurosis or one-sidedness. Yet despite these differences, there are profound resonances between the two thinkers, points where they were describing similar realities in different languages. Both insisted on the primacy of lived experience over abstract concepts. Both resisted the mechanistic reduction of consciousness to neural processes. Both valued a kind of knowing that transcended rational analysis, Bergson's intuition, Jung's symbolic understanding. Both recognized that consciousness as ordinarily experienced was only a small portion of psychological reality, that something vast lay beyond or beneath the ego's awareness. Consider their respective attitudes towards science. Neither was anti-scientific, but both insisted that the methods of natural science were inadequate for understanding consciousness. Bergson argued that science achieved its success precisely by translating duration into space, by treating time as a measurable quantity, by breaking continuous wholes into discrete units that could be manipulated mathematically. This was necessary for technological control of nature. But when these same methods were turned toward consciousness, they missed what was essential, the flowing, continuous, qualitative nature of lived experience. Jung similarly insisted that consciousness could not be understood through the reductive methods of natural science. The psyche had to be approached phenomenologically through careful observation of its manifestations, through attention to symbols and images that could not be translated into quantitative measurements without losing their essential meaning. A dream, Jung noted, could not be understood by analyzing the neural correlates of REM sleep. The symbolic content was primary, and symbols required hermeneutic interpretation, not causal explanation. Both men thus opened space for a psychology that honored subjectivity without abandoning systematic inquiry. Bergson's intuitive method and Jung's amplification of symbols were both rigorous approaches that required training and discipline, even though they differed radically from laboratory experimentation. Both suggested that understanding consciousness required a kind of knowledge that participated in what it knew, that placed itself inside the experience rather than observing from the outside. This participatory knowing had mystical dimensions for both thinkers, though they expressed this differently. Bergson argued that intuition, when fully developed, allowed consciousness to grasp its own duration, and then, by extension, the duration of all life, ultimately experiencing the élan vital itself. This was a kind of mystical knowledge, a direct experience of the creative impulse that drove the universe. In his final major work, the two sources of morality and religion, Bergson distinguished between closed religion, which was social and ritualistic, and open religion, which was based on the mystical experience of creative saints who experienced directly the love that was the ultimate nature of reality. Jung similarly insisted that genuine psychological development opened onto religious experience, though he carefully distinguished between religion as institutional doctrine and religion as direct encounter with the numinous. The archetypes were numinous. They carried a charge of religious intensity that seized the ego with a power beyond rational control. The experience of the self in the individuation process was a mystical experience, an encounter with wholeness that transcended the ego's limited identity. Jung's psychology was inherently religious in this sense, even though he insisted he was speaking psychologically rather than metaphysically, describing the phenomena of religious experience without making claims about the ultimate nature of reality. Here we encounter an intriguing difference in their metaphysical caution. Bergson, despite his resistance to mechanistic metaphysics, was willing to make bold metaphysical claims. The élan vital was not just a psychological phenomenon, but the creative principle of the universe itself. Duration was not just how consciousness experienced time, but the fundamental nature of reality. Intuition gave access not just to psychological truth, but to metaphysical truth. Bergson remained a philosopher in the grand tradition, attempting to understand being itself. Jung, especially in his mature years, became increasingly cautious about metaphysical claims. He insisted he was describing psychological phenomena, not making assertions about ultimate reality. The archetypes were psychological structures, patterns of experience, not metaphysical entities existing independently of human consciousness. When he spoke of the self, he was describing the archetype of wholeness as it manifested in psychic experience, not claiming to know the ultimate ground of being. This caution was partly temperamental, partly strategic. Jung was already controversial enough without making sweeping metaphysical assertions, but it also reflected his conviction that psychology had to remain empirical in its own way, grounded in observable phenomena even when those phenomena were inner experiences rather than external behaviors. Yet Jung's caution was often undermined by his own language, which frequently suggested more than he officially claimed. When he wrote about synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that could not be explained by causality, he was proposing that psyche and matter were not separate substances, but two aspects of a deeper unity, an unus mundus that underlay the apparent dualism of subject and object. This was a metaphysical claim, however much Jung framed it in psychological terms. Similarly, his explorations of alchemy suggested that the alchemical process was simultaneously psychological and cosmological, that the individuation process participated in the transformation of matter itself. Bergson's metaphysics of creative evolution and Jung's psychology of individuation share a fundamentally teleological character, though their teleologies differ. For Bergson, life moved toward increasing complexity, consciousness, and freedom. Evolution was not random but had direction, driven by the élan vital. This was not a predetermined telos. The specific forms that life created could not be predicted in advance, but there was a general movement toward greater consciousness and greater freedom from determinism. For Jung, the individuation process moved toward wholeness, toward the realization of the self. This was built into the psyche as a kind of internal teleology, a drive toward integration and completeness that would unfold if the ego cooperated with the unconscious. The specific content of any individual's individuation was unique, but the process itself was archetypal, following patterns that appeared throughout human history in myths of death and rebirth, in alchemical symbolism, in mystical literature. Both teleologies resisted mechanistic causality. Both insisted that the future could not be reduced to the rearrangement of elements already present. Both affirmed that something genuinely new emerged through the creative process, whether of life's evolution or psyche's individuation. Yet Bergson's teleology was cosmic and biological. Jung's was psychological and symbolic. Bergson traced the emergence of consciousness through evolutionary time. Jung traced the emergence of consciousness through individual psychological development and through the historical symbolism of cultures. Their different emphases on the temporal versus the eternal, on continuous flow versus structured depth, on creative becoming versus archetypal patterns, can perhaps be understood as complementary rather than contradictory. Consciousness, as we live it, has both the flowing, continuous character Bergson emphasized and the structured, symbolic character Jung emphasized. We experience ourselves as both becoming and being, both flowing forward in time and rooted in depths that connect us to something timeless. Bergson captured something essential about the horizontal dimension of consciousness, its movement through time, its continuous creation of the new, its forward-flowing momentum. Jung captured something essential about the vertical dimension of consciousness, its depth, its grounding in archetypal patterns, its connection to the collective and transpersonal. A full understanding of consciousness perhaps requires both dimensions, both the durée that flows and the archetypes that structure, both the surface stream and the deep wells. Consider how each would understand a moment of creative insight. For Bergson, this would be intuition functioning at its highest, consciousness coinciding with its own creative movement, directly grasping possibilities rather than analyzing them conceptually. The insight would be genuinely new, not deducible from previous states, a true creation emerging from the free flow of duration. Such moments were characterized by their immediacy, their indivisible unity, their resistance to translation into abstract concepts. For Jung, the same moment would involve the constellation of archetypal material from the unconscious. The insight would feel like it came from somewhere beyond the ego, because it did. It came from the objective psyche, perhaps from the self, organizing unconscious material into a new pattern. The creative person was not creating ex nihilo, but receiving something from the unconscious and giving it form. This was why Jung insisted that artists and creative people needed to be somewhat passive, allowing the unconscious to speak through them rather than forcing meaning through conscious intention. Both descriptions honor the mystery and power of creative insight while framing it differently. Bergson emphasizes the freedom and novelty, the way consciousness transcends its past and creates something unprecedented. Jung emphasizes the givenness of the insight, the way it comes as a gift from sources beyond ego control, carrying symbolic content that connects to eternal patterns. Perhaps creative insight has both qualities. It is both radically new and deeply ancient, both unprecedented and archetypal. Similarly, both thinkers would recognize the phenomenon of a life lived creatively versus a life lived mechanically, though they would describe it differently. Bergson distinguished between actions that flow from the whole personality, expressing our deepest duration, and actions that follow habitual patterns laid down by past conditioning. Genuine freedom meant acting from the totality of who we are, our entire past gathered into the present moment, expressing itself in a creative act that could not have been predicted from knowledge of our character or circumstances. A life lived creatively was one of continuous self-creation, of each moment adding something genuinely new to what we had been. Jung would describe a creative life as one lived in dialogue with the unconscious, in which the ego remained open to symbolic communications from the self, in which the individuation process unfolded through attention to dreams and active imagination, through withdrawal of projections and integration of shadow. A mechanical life was one lived entirely from the ego's limited perspective, cut off from the deeper wisdom of the unconscious, following collective expectations rather than individual destiny. The creative life required suffering and sacrifice, the sacrifice of ego's illusion of complete control, the suffering of encountering aspects of ourselves we would prefer to avoid, but it led to wholeness and authenticity. Again, the descriptions complement more than contradict. A life lived from the whole personality, in Bergson's terms, would naturally involve Jung's dialogue between ego and unconscious. A life lived in individuation, in Jung's terms, would express the creative freedom Bergson valued. The languages differ. Bergson's philosophical and phenomenological, Jung's psychological and symbolic, but they point towards similar realities. Where they genuinely diverge is in their attitude toward the collective and the past. Bergson's philosophy emphasized freedom from the past, the constant creation of the new, the transcendence of fixed forms. He worried about habit and social pressure that would constrain the creative flow of duration, that would impose mechanical patterns on living spontaneity. Society, for Bergson, was often a conservative force, using ritual, morality, and social pressure to channel behavior into predictable patterns. Genuine creativity required breaking free from these constraints, recovering the direct experience of duration that social conditioning obscured. Jung, while certainly valuing individual development, saw the collective as having both oppressive and nourishing dimensions. The collective consciousness could indeed constrain, imposing personas and social roles that disconnected the person from their authentic self. But the collective unconscious was the source of psychic life, the ground of meaning and symbolic richness. Connection to archetypal patterns did not constrain but empowered, linking the individual to transpersonal sources of wisdom and energy. The danger was not being rooted in the collective unconscious, but being unconsciously identified with it, possessed by archetypal patterns rather than consciously relating to them. This difference reflects their different disciplines and concerns. Bergson was addressing philosophical questions about freedom, determinism, and the nature of time. He needed to emphasize creativity and novelty to counter mechanistic philosophies that reduced everything to rearrangements of pre-existing elements. Jung was addressing psychological questions about meaning, neurosis, and development. He needed to emphasize the archetypal and collective to counter the reductive individualism of Freud's psychology, and the superficial rationalism of consciousness that recognized no depths. In their attitude toward modernity, both were critics while remaining modern figures themselves. Bergson criticized the spatializing tendency of modern science and technology, the way mechanistic thinking missed the living reality of duration. But he was thoroughly modern in his method, in his engagement with science, in his attempt to articulate a philosophy adequate to evolutionary biology and contemporary psychology. He did not advocate return to pre-modern ways of thinking, but rather a reformation of modern thought that would honor lived experience alongside scientific understanding. Jung similarly criticized modern rationalism and materialism, the way modernity had lost connection to symbolic and mythological ways of knowing, creating what he called a spiritual neurosis. Modern people, cut off from religious traditions that no longer held meaning, suffered from lack of connection to the archetypal depths. Yet Jung did not advocate simple return to traditional religion. The solution was not to go back, but to go down, to encounter the archetypes directly through psychological work rather than through inherited dogma. This was a thoroughly modern project, using psychological methods to recover dimensions of experience that traditional societies had accessed through religion and myth. Both men thus represent what we might call the spiritual modernism of the early 20th century, attempts to articulate visions of consciousness and reality that honored dimensions of experience modernity had marginalized while remaining intellectually and methodologically modern. They were part of a broader movement that included William James, Edmund Husserl, Martin Buber, and others who sought to expand modern consciousness rather than reject modernity entirely. In their personal styles and temperaments, the two men differed markedly. Bergson was Apollonian clear, precise, elegant in expression, his philosophical arguments carefully constructed, his lectures models of lucid exposition. Those who heard him speak remembered his extraordinary clarity, the way complex philosophical ideas became transparent under his articulation. He embodied a certain classical ideal of the philosopher as master of language and logic, even when arguing for realities beyond logic. Jung was more Dionysian, passionate, exploratory, sometimes obscure in expression, his writings dense with allusions and mythological references, his psychological investigations taking him into strange territories that made many of his colleagues uncomfortable. He was willing to look foolish, willing to entertain ideas that seemed outlandish astrology, alchemy, flying saucers if they shed light on psychological phenomena. He embodied the romantic ideal of the explorer who ventures into unknown territories, bringing back reports that challenge conventional understanding. Yet both were trying to articulate something similar at the deepest level, a vision of human consciousness that honored its creative freedom, its depth, its resistance to mechanistic reduction. Both insisted that the living reality of subjective experience was primary, not derivative from or reducible to physical processes. Both attempted to develop methods adequate to studying consciousness from within rather than from the external perspective of natural science. Both valued a kind of knowing that participated in what it knew, that placed itself inside the flow of experience rather than observing from outside. Perhaps we can see them as representing two necessary approaches to the same mystery. Bergson approached from philosophy, from careful phenomenological description, from analysis of concepts like time, memory, freedom, seeking to show the inadequacy of mechanistic explanations and to point toward the creative reality of duration. Jung approached from psychology, from attention to dreams and symbols, from amplification of mythological motifs, seeking to map the structures of the psyche and guide the process of individuation. One moved through time and flow, the other through depth and symbol, but both were attempting to restore to modern consciousness an understanding of its own richness and creative potential. The 20th century after them saw the decline of both their direct influence in many ways. Bergson's philosophy was largely displaced by analytic philosophy's focus on language and logic, by existentialism's focus on anxiety and authenticity, by phenomenology's increasingly technical elaborations. Jung's psychology remained influential in certain circles but was marginalized in academic psychology, which turned toward behaviorism and then cognitivism, both of which avoided the depth dimensions Jung emphasized. Yet both continued to influence, often indirectly, often unacknowledged. The stream of consciousness technique in literature owes much to Bergsonian duration. The interest in mythology and symbolism in fields from religious studies to anthropology owes much to Jungian amplification. And in recent decades, there has been a revival of interest in both thinkers as the limitations of mechanistic approaches become increasingly apparent. Bergson's insights about time and consciousness resonate with contemporary phenomenology and with attempts to understand consciousness from first-person perspectives. Jung's psychology speaks to contemporary seekers dissatisfied with reductive materialism, looking for ways to understand religious and spiritual experience without either dismissing it as illusion or accepting traditional dogma uncritically. What might it mean to bring their insights together more explicitly, to think about consciousness with both Bergsonian duration and Jungian depth in view? Such a synthesis would recognize that consciousness is simultaneously flowing and structured, simultaneously creating the new and expressing eternal patterns, simultaneously temporal and timeless. It would honor both the horizontal movement through time that Bergson emphasized and the vertical depth that Jung explored. It would value both intuitive immediacy and symbolic interpretation, both the freedom of creative becoming and the grounding in archetypal forms. This synthesis might offer resources for understanding consciousness that neither thinker alone provides. Bergson's emphasis on duration could help correct Jung's sometimes static treatment of archetypes, showing how even eternal patterns are lived through temporal unfolding, how they evolve and transform in the continuous creativity of lived experience. Jung's emphasis on symbolic depth could help correct Bergson's relative neglect of the unconscious, showing how duration itself is not simply continuous flow, but is structured by archetypal patterns, how consciousness is always already shaped by symbolic forms that are not simply created in each moment but draw on transpersonal sources. Such a synthesis would also need to address where they genuinely conflict, where choosing one perspective means rejecting the other. Can we really hold together Bergson's emphasis on radical novelty with Jung's emphasis on eternal archetypal patterns? Can consciousness be simultaneously pure creative becoming and structured by timeless forms? Or must we choose between a metaphysics of time and a metaphysics of depth? Perhaps the answer lies in recognizing different levels or dimensions of consciousness. At the phenomenological level, Bergson is right. We experience consciousness as continuous flow, as duration in which past and present interpenetrate, in which each moment brings something new. But at a deeper level, Jung is right. This flow is not structureless, but is shaped by archetypal patterns, by symbolic forms that constrain and channel the creative process. The archetypes are not external to duration, but are the internal structures of creativity itself, the patterns through which novelty manifests. Or we might say that consciousness has both horizontal and vertical dimensions that cannot be reduced to each other. Horizontally, consciousness extends through time, as Bergson described, continuously creating itself, adding novelty to existence. Vertically, consciousness extends into depth, as Jung described, connecting to archetypal forms that transcend temporal existence. Full consciousness requires movement in both dimensions, the temporal unfolding of individuation and the atemporal encounter with archetypal wholeness. In this view, Bergson and Jung are not contradicting, but complementing each other, each capturing one dimension of a reality that requires both perspectives for full understanding. We need Bergson to understand consciousness as lived temporally, as creative freedom, as continuous becoming. We need Jung to understand consciousness as structured, symbolically, as connected to transpersonal depths, as seeking, wholeness. Together they offer a richer picture than either alone. This brings us to the broader question of what consciousness is, which both men struggled with throughout their careers. Neither accepted the mechanistic answer that consciousness is merely an epiphenomenon of brain processes, a kind of illusion produced by neural activity. Both insisted on the reality and primacy of conscious experience. But what is this consciousness that both spent their lives exploring? For Bergson, consciousness was memory, the accumulation of the past, duration itself as it manifested in living beings. Consciousness expanded as more of the past was retained, as the scope of memory increased, allowing for more flexible and creative responses to the present. The highest form of consciousness was intuitive consciousness that grasped duration directly, coinciding with the creative process itself. For Jung, consciousness was a recent and precarious achievement of psychic evolution, a state in which contents were related to an ego that could reflect on them and make choices. Consciousness emerged from the unconscious and always remained in dialogue with it. Expanded consciousness meant not just ego awareness, but the ego's relationship with the self. The achievement of a center that transcended ego while including it. The realization of wholeness that integrated conscious and unconscious dimensions of the psyche. Both definitions point beyond simple awareness or attention towards something more substantive and mysterious. Consciousness for both was not just a spotlight illuminating pre-existing objects, but was itself creative, constitutive of reality as we experience it. For Bergson, consciousness was the creative power itself, duration manifesting as freedom and novelty. For Jung, consciousness was necessary for the psyche to realize its potential, for the archetypes to become actualized in individual lives, for the self to be known. This points toward a profound agreement beneath their differences. Both saw consciousness not as passive observation, but as active participation in the unfolding of reality. Bergson's intuition placed consciousness inside the creative process, knowing it from within by coinciding with it. Jung's active imagination placed consciousness in dialogue with the unconscious, participating in the symbolic process by which archetypes manifested. Neither saw consciousness as merely representing a reality external to it. Both saw consciousness as somehow constitutive of reality, at least the reality we can know. This idealist strain in both thinkers, their insistence on the primacy of consciousness, ran counter to the dominant materialism of their times and ours. Yet neither was a subjective idealist, denying the reality of matter or the external world. Bergson's philosophy was a kind of dual-aspect theory in which consciousness and matter were two manifestations of the same underlying creative process. Two ways the élan vital expressed itself. Jung's psychology similarly suggested that psyche and matter were two aspects of a deeper unity, the unus mundus, even though he approached this philosophically rather than psychologically. In our contemporary moment, when consciousness studies struggles with what philosopher David Chalmers called the hard problem, why subjective experience exists at all, rather than everything happening in the dark, Bergson and Jung offer resources from different directions. Bergson shows why the hard problem arises from trying to explain consciousness using concepts appropriate to matter and space, why the attempt to reduce consciousness to brain mechanisms must fail because it tries to translate duration into spatial terms. The solution is not to find a better mechanistic explanation, but to recognize that consciousness is primary, that it cannot be explained in terms of anything else precisely because it is the condition of all explanation. Jung shows why purely objective, third-person accounts of consciousness miss what matters most: the symbolic meaning, the numinous quality, the purposiveness that emerges in the dialogue between ego and unconscious. A complete account of a dream that mapped every neural correlation would still miss the dream itself as a communication from the unconscious, as a compensation for conscious attitude, as a pointer toward needed development. This is not because of ignorance that more neuroscience could remedy, but because the symbolic dimension operates on a different level than the causal. Both suggest that consciousness is not a problem to be solved by reduction, but a mystery to be lived and explored through appropriate methods. Bergson's intuition, Jung's symbolic interpretation, both invite us into a different relationship with our own consciousness, not as external observers trying to explain it mechanistically, but as participants seeking to know it from within, to develop it, to allow it to realize its creative potential. This participatory epistemology is perhaps their most important shared legacy. In an age dominated by the ideal of objective knowledge that treats everything, including consciousness, as an object to be analyzed from outside, Bergson and Jung insisted on forms of knowledge that require subjective participation, that change the knower in the process of knowing, that cannot be achieved through detached observation. Intuiting duration changes how we experience time. Engaging with archetypal images through active imagination changes the structure of consciousness itself. This is knowledge as transformation rather than knowledge as information, and it requires different virtues than objective science, not just intellectual acuity, but also courage, honesty about oneself, willingness to sacrifice comfortable illusions, patience with ambiguity and paradox. Both men embodied these virtues in their different ways and invited others to develop them through psychological and philosophical practice. Yet both also maintained rigor and systematic thought. Neither descended into pure subjectivism or mystical vagueness. Bergson's philosophical arguments were models of precision even when pointing beyond logical analysis. Jung's psychological observations were carefully documented even when they concerned numinous experiences. Both showed that honoring subjectivity and lived experience did not require abandoning systematic inquiry or intellectual discipline. In this, they offer a middle path between reductive scientism that explains away consciousness and anti-intellectual mysticism that abandons careful thought. This middle path, rigorous attention to lived experience, systematic exploration of consciousness from within, articulation of findings in ways that others can test against their own experience, may be more necessary now than ever in psychology and philosophy. As we consider what modern psychology might learn from bringing these two figures into conversation, several possibilities emerge. First, greater attention to the temporal structure of consciousness, to the ways past and present interpenetrate in experience, to the distortions introduced when we spatialize time for purposes of measurement. Much of cognitive psychology treats memory as retrieval of stored information, but Bergson's insights suggest this metaphor misses something essential about how the past lives in consciousness. Second, more sophisticated understanding of intuition, not as vague feeling, but as a distinct way of knowing, one that grasps wholes rather than parts, that knows from within rather than from without, that cannot be reduced to rapid unconscious inference, even though it may involve unconscious processing. Jung's typology and Bergson's philosophical analysis could both inform contemporary work on intuitive expertise and decision-making. Third, recognition that consciousness has depth, dimensions that require symbolic interpretation, that not everything psychological can be captured in causal explanations or information processing models. Jung's archetypal psychology offers resources for understanding religious experience, the meaning-making function, the role of myths and symbols in psychological life that remain vital despite modernity's supposed disenchantment. Fourth, appreciation of consciousness as fundamentally creative rather than merely adaptive, as oriented toward meaning and wholeness rather than merely toward survival and reproduction. Both Bergson and Jung challenge the evolutionary psychology that reduces all psychological phenomena to adaptation, showing that consciousness transcends its origins, that it creates novelty and seeks values that cannot be reduced to fitness advantages. Finally, both point toward the possibility of developing consciousness, of expanding awareness, not just by accumulating information, but by transforming the structure of consciousness itself through Bergsonian intuition that learns to think in duration, through Jungian individuation that integrates unconscious contents and relates to archetypal depths. This developmental dimension, the idea that consciousness has potentials to be actualized through practice, remains under-theorized in mainstream psychology, but is central to both thinkers. Bringing Bergson and Jung together, we find not a finished system, but a set of complementary perspectives, tools for thinking about consciousness in its richness and mystery. We find the invitation to know consciousness, both as it flows through time and as it extends into symbolic depth, both as it creates novelty and as it expresses eternal patterns, both as individual achievement and as participation in something transpersonal. We find two voices in dialogue, agreeing that consciousness cannot be reduced to mechanism, disagreeing about whether its ground is temporal duration or archetypal depth, together pointing toward the need for a psychology that honors subjectivity without abandoning rigor. This is the gift of their encounter, whether direct or across time, the expansion of possibility for understanding what we are as conscious beings, the opening of multiple pathways for exploring the psyche, the insistence that consciousness matters not just as a problem to be explained, but as the very medium through which we engage reality and create meaning. In their different ways, both refuse to let consciousness be explained away, reduced, dismissed as epiphenomenal. Both insisted on its primacy and its mystery, its creative power and its depth. Now, as we move toward the conclusion of this exploration, let us step back from comparative analysis and allow ourselves to reflect more freely and lyrically on what the dialogue between these two minds illuminates about human consciousness and the life of the soul. Consider the image of a river, which both men might have used, though, to different purposes. A river flows, it moves, it carries, its past with it in the momentum of its current. It creates its bed through the very act of flowing, wearing away rocks, depositing silt, constantly reshaping the landscape through which it moves. This is consciousness as Bergson saw it: duration, continuous, becoming. The creative flow that cannot be stopped at any instant without falsifying its nature, that must be grasped from within the movement itself. But a river also has depth, and in its depths are currents that move differently than the surface, eddies and pools where water circles rather than flows forward, places where what sank down long ago remains suspended in darkness, where old drowned things rest and new life stirs in the silt. This is consciousness, as Jung saw it, layered, structured, with depths that the surface stream knows nothing about, populated by forms and forces that rise up unbidden to disturb the surface's clarity. Both views are true. The river is both flow and depth, both moving forward and sinking down. To understand the river, we need to attend to its temporal movement and to its vertical dimension, to trace where it has come from and where it is going, and also to explore what lives in its depths, what it carries in suspension, what shapes its course from below. Human consciousness is that river, or perhaps it is better to say that each of us is that river, flowing through time with the accumulated momentum of everything we have experienced, creating ourselves anew in each moment through choices that could not have been predicted, yet also drawing on depths that connect us to sources beyond our individual existence, shaped by patterns that are not personal inventions, but inheritances from the long history of consciousness itself. To live consciously, in the fullest sense, means to honor both dimensions. It means to experience duration, as Bergson described it, to feel the continuous flow of our becoming, to recognize that we are not a fixed thing, but a process, not a static self, but a creative momentum. It means recovering the vividness of immediate experience, the qualitative richness of each moment, the felt sense of time as lived rather than as measured. It means recognizing our freedom, not as the abstract freedom of philosophical definition, but as the living freedom of consciousness coinciding with its own creative process, making choices that express the totality of who we have become. But living consciously also means descending into depth, as Jung charted, attending to dreams that bubble up from the unconscious, recognizing the symbolic dimension of experience, acknowledging that we are not masters in our own house, that the ego is not the whole of consciousness, but only its surface representative. It means encountering the archetypes that structure our experience, the patterns that repeat in our lives despite our intentions, the numinous presences that seize us in moments of overwhelming emotion or insight. It means undertaking the individuation process, that difficult journey toward wholeness that requires facing shadow and anima, persona, and self. These two movements forward through time and downward into depth are not opposed, but complementary. The flow carries what rises from depth. The depth receives what the flow has learned. Consciousness individuates through time, the self emerging through the temporal process of a whole life. But consciousness also touches timeless patterns, experiences, moments when time seems to stop, or when past and future collapse into an eternal present. There are moments in human life when both dimensions become simultaneously visible, when we experience both duration and depth in the same instant. These are the moments that both men valued most highly, though they named them differently. For Bergson, it might be the moment of genuine intuition when consciousness coincides with its own creative process, knowing itself directly without mediation. For Jung, it might be the moment of numinous encounter with an archetypal image, when the ego meets something greater than itself and is transformed by the meeting. Consider falling in love, that universal yet always unique experience. From a Bergsonian perspective, falling in love involves the whole person, the entirety of our duration, gathering into a choice that could not have been predicted, that creates something genuinely new in the universe. This particular love between these particular people that has never existed before and will never exist again. The experience has the quality of freedom and creation, of consciousness flowing beyond its previous boundaries into unprecedented territory. From a Jungian perspective, falling in love involves projection of the anima or animus, the constellation of archetypal patterns that have appeared in lovers' experiences throughout human history. The particular form is unique, but the pattern is ancient. The beloved as carrier of the divine image, the sense of completion through union, the mythological themes of sacred marriage and hieros gamos. The experience connects the individual to transpersonal depths, activating energies that transcend personal history. Both views illuminate. Love is both radically creative and archetypal, both unprecedented and as old as humanity, both a free choice expressing our unique duration and a necessity imposed by forces beyond conscious control. To understand it fully requires both perspectives, both the sense of creating something new and the sense of being carried by ancient patterns. Or consider the experience of creative insight, whether artistic or scientific. The moment when a solution suddenly appears, when a poem writes itself, when the next move in a problem becomes obvious, this moment feels both free and given, both actively created and passively received. Bergson would emphasize the creative novelty, the way the insight could not have been deduced from previous states, the freedom of consciousness to generate the genuinely new. Jung would emphasize how the insight comes from the unconscious, how creative people are channels for something that flows through them, how creative work often feels like active imagination, like receiving communications from autonomous sources within the psyche. Again, both are right. The creative moment is both free creation and reception of gift, both individual achievement and participation in something transpersonal. Great creators often report both feelings simultaneously, the sense that they worked hard to achieve something and the sense that it was given to them, that they merely received what wanted to manifest through them. These paradoxical unions of opposites, free and faded, new and ancient, created and received, point to something essential about consciousness that both Bergson and Jung recognized in their different ways. Consciousness is not simple, not unitary, not easily reduced to a single principle. It has multiple dimensions that appear contradictory when frozen in static concepts, but that interpenetrate in lived experience. The Western philosophical tradition, at least since Plato, has often sought unity and simplicity, has tried to find the one principle that explains everything else, has been uncomfortable with paradox and contradiction. Bergson challenged this by showing that the apparent contradictions dissolve when we think in duration rather than in static spatial terms. Freedom and determinism are not contradictory when we recognize that we are not determined by our past, as if it were a set of external forces pushing us, but that we are our past, that the accumulated duration of everything we've experienced constitutes who we are and expresses itself freely in each moment. Jung challenged the search for unity by showing that the psyche contains genuine opposites that must be held in tension rather than dissolved into synthesis. Consciousness and unconscious, persona and shadow, anima and animus, ego and self. These are not mistakes to be corrected, but structural features of the psyche that generate creative tension when properly related. The goal is not to eliminate paradox, but to achieve what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold opposites in consciousness simultaneously without being torn apart by their tension. Perhaps what we learn from bringing these two thinkers together is the capacity to hold their complementary perspectives in creative tension without demanding premature synthesis. Consciousness is both flow and depth, both temporal and eternal, both continuously creative and structured by recurring patterns. To know consciousness fully, we must learn to shift between these perspectives, to see now with Bergson's eyes and now with Jung's, to honor both the river's movement and its depths. This capacity to hold multiple perspectives, to see the same reality from different angles without reducing everything to a single view, is itself a development of consciousness. It represents a kind of cognitive flexibility and spiritual maturity that both men valued. Bergson's intuition involved the capacity to place oneself alternately inside duration and in the spatializing perspective of practical action, knowing when each was appropriate. Jung's individuation involved the capacity to differentiate and then relate multiple aspects of the psyche, to speak now from ego and now from shadow, now from persona and now from anima, achieving a dialogical consciousness that could contain multiplicity. This dialogical, perspectival approach to consciousness seems increasingly necessary in our contemporary world. We face problems that cannot be solved from single perspectives, that require holding multiple ways of knowing in creative tension. Climate change, for instance, requires both the scientific understanding that measures and predicts, and the felt sense of our embeddedness in nature, both rational analysis and intuitive connection to the living earth. The crisis of meaning that many experience in secular modernity requires both psychological understanding and spiritual resources, both analysis of how meaning-making works and participation in symbolic processes that generate meaning. Bergson and Jung, in dialogue, offer resources for this both and thinking, this capacity to honor multiple dimensions without collapsing into relativism or fragmentation. They show that consciousness can expand to hold paradox, can develop methods appropriate to different domains of reality, can honor both scientific precision and symbolic meaning, both forward movement through time and depth dimensions that transcend time. In the quiet of this late hour, as sleep draws near, perhaps what lingers from this long exploration is not any particular concept or argument, but a sense of the vastness of consciousness, of how much there is to know and experience and become. Both Bergson and Jung spent lifetimes exploring consciousness, and both left more questions than answers, more openings than conclusions. Neither claimed to have solved the mystery of consciousness. Both merely offered ways of engaging with it more fully, of honoring its depth and complexity. This humility before the mystery, combined with bold exploration and rigorous thought, characterizes both men at their best. They were not content with conventional answers or mechanistic reductions, but neither did they abandon critical thinking for mystical vagueness. They pushed the boundaries of what could be known while respecting the limits of knowledge, articulating what could be said while acknowledging what remained ineffable. In this, they offer a model not just of particular theories, but of how to engage with consciousness as such. They show that understanding consciousness requires both methodological rigor and personal transformation, both systematic investigation and lived experience, both intellectual courage and spiritual openness. They demonstrate that knowing consciousness is not like knowing objects in the world, requiring detached observation and measurement, but is a participatory knowing that changes the knower, a form of knowledge that is also a form of development. For those of us who come after, heir to their explorations, the task is not to choose between them or to synthesize them into a final system, but to continue the exploration they began, using their insights while remaining open to dimensions they did not foresee. Consciousness continues to evolve. perhaps now more rapidly than ever, as new technologies and social forms create unprecedented challenges and possibilities. We cannot simply apply their theories mechanically to our situation. We must do what they did, engage directly with the living reality of consciousness as it manifests now, using whatever methods illuminate. Yet their examples remain valuable. Their maps still chart territories we traverse. When we experience the flow of lived time, we can recognize Bergsonian duration. When we encounter a dream image that seems to carry more meaning than we can fathom, we can draw on Jungian amplification. When we seek to know ourselves more fully, we can practice both intuitive coinciding with our own becoming and symbolic dialogue with unconscious depths. The dialogue between Bergson and Jung is not a historical curiosity, but a living conversation that continues wherever people seek to understand consciousness in its fullness. Each generation must take up the questions anew. What is consciousness? How does it relate to time? What is the unconscious? How do we know ourselves? What is the relationship between individual consciousness and something greater that it participates in? And each generation will answer in ways shaped by their particular historical moment, while also touching on timeless dimensions. What Bergson and Jung accomplished was to open space for these questions, to legitimize inquiry into subjective experience and symbolic meaning, to insist that consciousness could not be reduced to mechanism, to offer methods and concepts that later explorers could use and refine. They lived through an era when the dominant paradigm dismissed consciousness as epiphenomenal or attempted to reduce it to neural processes. They resisted that reduction not through obscurantism or anti-science sentiment, but through careful attention to phenomena that mechanism could not explain, through articulation of alternative frameworks that honored complexity and mystery. In our own era, when consciousness studies is finally achieving academic respectability, when contemplative practices like meditation are being scientifically studied, when the limits of purely objective approaches are increasingly recognized, their work takes on new relevance. They anticipated many contemporary insights about the embodied, inactive, embedded nature of consciousness. They understood that consciousness is not a thing but a process, not located in the brain alone, but distributed across body and environment, not simply representing reality, but actively participating in its constitution. Yet, they also go beyond much contemporary work by insisting on dimensions of consciousness that naturalistic approaches still struggle to accommodate the genuinely creative freedom that Bergson described. The numinous archetypal encounter that Jung witnessed, the spiritual dimensions of consciousness that both affirmed in their different ways. As consciousness studies matures, it will need to grapple more fully with these dimensions, and Bergson and Jung offer resources for doing so. The question of consciousness is the question of what we are, which is also the question of what the universe is, since we are not separate from the universe, but its way of becoming conscious of itself. When we explore consciousness, we are the universe examining itself, duration, reflecting on duration, the creative process becoming self-aware. This is what both men understood, what gave their work its urgency and significance. They were not merely developing abstract theories, but participating in the universe's self-understanding, in the long process by which consciousness evolves toward fuller awareness of itself. In this cosmic process, each individual consciousness matters. Each person's individuation, each lived experience of duration, each moment of intuitive knowing or archetypal encounter contributes something to the whole. We are not separate observers of consciousness, but participants in its ongoing creation, responsible for developing the potential we have been given, for adding our particular voice to the symphony of consciousness becoming aware of itself. This sense of participation and responsibility gives meaning to the psychological and philosophical work that both men undertook. They were not just theorizing, but were themselves developing consciousness, both their own and that of their culture, creating new possibilities of self-understanding that subsequent generations could enter into. When we read them now, when we practice intuitive knowing or active imagination, when we attend to duration or explore archetypal depths, we continue that work. We participate in the same process of consciousness evolving toward fuller self-awareness. As sleep approaches and this long meditation draws toward silence, let the concepts and comparisons, the arguments and analysis settle like silt in still water. What remains is simpler and more essential. Two men who devoted their lives to understanding consciousness, who developed methods for exploring inner life, who insisted that the life of the mind and soul mattered, who refused to let consciousness be explained away. They stand as examples of what human beings can achieve when we commit ourselves to knowing most deeply what we are, when we pursue wisdom rather than merely information, when we allow the questions of consciousness and self to become the organizing principle of our lives. In your own life, dear listener, the questions they explored remain relevant. How do you experience time as the abstract measured succession of clock hours, or as lived duration in which past and present interpenetrate? Do you attend to your dreams, recognizing them as communications from depths beyond ego control? Have you encountered the archetypes in numinous moments that seized you with power beyond rational explanation? Do you practice intuition, learning to know from within rather than merely analyzing from without? Are you engaged in individuation, in the difficult work of becoming whole? These are not merely theoretical questions, but invitations to practice, to lived experience, to the development of consciousness that both men valued above all. Their theories matter not as final truths to be accepted or rejected, but as maps for exploration, as descriptions, too, of territories you can traverse yourself, as invitations to verify through your own experience what they discovered through theirs. The night deepens, and the boundary between waking and sleeping grows thin. In this liminal space, perhaps consciousness reveals itself differently than in the bright light of day, less as an object to be analyzed and more as the mystery we live from within. Here, Bergson's duration and Jung's unconscious both become palpable. The flow of time slowing and thickening, images rising unbidden from depths, boundaries dissolving between self and world, past and present, sleeping and waking. This is the place both men honored. This twilight consciousness where rational analysis gives way to other forms of knowing, where intuition and image speak more truly than concepts, where the soul reveals itself not in definitions but in direct experience. They invite us not just to think about consciousness, but to know it from within, to develop it, to become more conscious. And so we end where we began, with two seekers of the soul, meeting across time and discipline, each illuminating what the other leaves in shadow, together mapping territories of consciousness more vast than either could traverse alone. Their dialogue continues in anyone who takes up the questions they explored, who refuses to let consciousness be diminished or explained away, who honors both the creative flow of duration and the symbolic depths of the unconscious, who recognizes that we are not finished, not fully conscious, not yet fully human, but always becoming, always developing, always being invited into fuller awareness of what we are and might become. Rest now in that knowledge. You are consciousness becoming aware of itself, duration flowing toward new creation, a unique expression of eternal patterns, both process and depth, both flow and structure, both utterly individual and deeply connected to everything that is. The work of becoming conscious continues in sleep as in waking, in dreams as in deliberate reflection, guided by wisdom deeper than ego, moving toward wholeness. Let these ideas settle into sleep. Let them work in the depths below waking consciousness. Let them become not just thoughts you've heard, but seeds planted in the soil of your own becoming. Tomorrow, or in days to come, they may sprout in unexpected ways, influencing how you experience time, how you attend to dreams, how you understand yourself. This is how ideas truly matter, not as abstract theories, but as lived possibilities, as ways of being that we try on and inhabit, as invitations to see consciousness differently and thereby to become different ourselves. The dialogue between Jung and Bergson continues in the dialogue between consciousness and its depths, between the moment and eternity, between what we are and what we might become. It continues in you, in the way you live, the questions they raised, in your own exploration of the territories they mapped but could not exhaust. Sleep well, wanderer, dream deeply, and know that in sleeping and waking both, consciousness flows on, creating itself anew in each moment, drawing from depths that connect you to everything that has ever been conscious, moving toward a wholeness that is given yet must be achieved, eternal yet always becoming. The river flows, carrying you forward. The depths beckon, offering wisdom and renewal. Both are yours. Both are you. Both are the mystery of consciousness exploring itself through your particular life. Good night.